Welcome to another episode of Muslims and Mental Health. Today we are going to discuss 10 questions couples should ask one another before having sex. The reason that I chose this topic today was for several reasons. One of them is that in the relationship of marriage, there are 4 primary issues that tend to become difficulties that lead to divorce. And of these 4 issues are sex, finances, in-laws, and children. It is disagreements in these 4 key areas that often tend to lead to divorce. And so as a service for our community, we need to start discussing these issues more and learning more about how we can avoid disagreement and problems in these areas. And one of the ways to do that is just to know more. So that we can communicate better and be better prepared when we're addressing them. Another reason why this topic is important is because it can lead to a functional marriage. Sexual dysfunction and the inability to communicate about these matters with your partner can lead to many problems like non-consensual sex between the husband and wife, emotional distance or physical distance, inappropriate uses of pornography, as well as adultery, emotional affairs, and ultimately divorce. So we want to avoid that, and the way we avoid that is to know more and learn how to communicate better about it. Let's talk a little bit though before we dive into the 10 questions about touching in general. I want to talk about this from a couple different perspectives. One is a history around the cultural norms of touching. Islamically, we know what our boundaries are in terms of touching, that we have permissibility and sanctioned relationships within marriage. Before marriage, this is not permissible, and we are aware of that, and that is something that's pretty clear. But historically in America, touch has also been something that hasn't really taken place. And I want to talk about that a little bit because we look at 2017 and think that people have been touching each other forever in America. Well, this is not the case. So if we go back to the early part of, like in the 1930s, for example, we can go back and we can find literature of publications. For example, there's a book called The Woman You Want to Be. And when you look inside this book, the author describes womanhood in terms of people getting a glance at her ankle, and just a glance at her wrist, and how this is sort of erotic in a way. It's a turn on for men in a way, because at that time in the 1930s, men were not seeing much of women's bodies, and the idea of exposing our nakedness and modesty in America just wasn't happening. As well, another tradition that at times can be controversial that I wanted to clue you into historically, the tradition of shaking hands with one another, is actually, the whole story has not been told. So I want to kind of clue you into that, although it's more of a minor type of touching. But historically in America, we equate shaking hands with trust, right? It's a way of garnering trust with another. However, we know that men and women did not do this equally. Men were the ones who shook hands with another. Women did not engage in this because whether you were Muslim or not, this was considered a no-go area. Women did not shake hands with men. That was a masculine thing, and it was when men and women started joining the workforce together, and women were made to comply and conform to male trait, where they were kind of forced to lose their feminization, if you will, that they started then shaking hands with men because they wanted equal opportunity, because they wanted to be viewed as equal to men, which we know as Muslims is kind of a ridiculous notion, because in the sight of Allah we're all equal, men and women. And it's unfortunate for our American society to have had that feminine quality sort of taken away in exchange for making women more like men, as opposed to appreciating the value of women being women and men being men, whatever that looks like, because it's not narrow a view, but at the same time appreciating that there's a boundary between men and women, and that women have their beauty and men have their beauty in their own way, and one does not have to become the other for that beauty to exist simultaneously. So just a little historical detour there for you, because the idea that we need to touch each other in society and all that's been normalized, of course, in 2017, but historically in America that has not always been the case. So it's not just a function of Islamic belief, it is also a historical, has been a historical reality in America. It is only with the more recent decades, certainly with the 50s and 60s and upwards, that we see, women having to take on these sort of male roles in order to be accepted in the workplace and understood to be trustworthy and so forth, which is something to give some food to, for thought, because do women really have to compromise in this way and their femininity, and is this what's missing in our society right now? Something to think about. But moving on, how do we begin this sensitive discussion around sex in marriage? It can be quite daunting at times to begin that discussion, and that's where we start, actually. We need to start with considering, at first, is this a person's first experience? Is it the first time they're getting married? Or is it, the second or third time that they're getting married, and so it's not their first experience? Or have there been other experiences outside of marriage? So one of the things you want to consider is this the first time the person's having sex? Because that kind of changes the conversation slightly in terms of one's comfortability, some of the sort of cautionary ways of approaching this that one needs to take. But in this conversation that we're having today, we're going to consider that this may be the first time someone is discussing sex. So for those of you who might be beyond that, you'll still get a benefit out of this conversation today, but I just want you to keep that in mind. So these are the things to consider before asking the 10 questions I'm going to teach you. One is, what knowledge does the person that you're talking with, your spouse, have about sex and about this topic before the conversation? So that's one thing to keep in mind. And as well, I said your spouse, but this could be a premarital discussion as well, right? And a very important premarital discussion to have. What were their family's views on this topic, right? So your potential spouse or your spouse, how did their parents interact with one another? Were they openly affectionate toward one another? Did they never show affection to one another? How was sex talked about within the family? These are all important things for you to know and consider before getting into these questions. Another is, what did they witness between their parents and grandparents as well, right? So you may be more familiar with what happened between your parents, but also consider the nature of the relationship between the grandparents. Because as we know, when it comes to marital issues, the relationship patterns can be traced back 10 generations. So maybe it didn't show up in your parents, but maybe it was modeled for you and the grandparents, or some configuration of the two. So just looking at your parents is not enough. You want to look at your grandparents as well on both sides of the relationship. In addition, what priority do you as an individual give sex when you envision your life? When you think about marriage and you envision that as an aspect, a piece of the parts of marriage, how much of a priority is that for you? How much of a priority do you think it will be for you? Both, what your current thinking is and in the future. Because as we know, down the line, when people are married, they tend to think about having children. And all of these different things, that life events sort of change in a way, the way we view different things, including sex. So just, keep that in mind as a consideration as well. And lastly, has your potential spouse or your spouse ever been inappropriately touched, or have they been sexually abused? This is a huge consideration to keep in mind before having this discussion. It is something you'll want to discuss before marriage, if possible. If it's not before marriage, you definitely want to discuss it after marriage, as this can be something that you may need assistance with, and something to not try to handle on one's own. So moving on, let's get started. Let's get into these questions that I know that you're wondering, what are they? So starting with question number 1, it should be kind of obvious, right? Have you ever had sex? So we're going to ask each other this question because we need to know. You certainly don't want to go into marriage blindly, and you don't want to not know the answer to this question. It's very important. Number 2, do you have an STI? STIs are sexually transmitted infections, also known previously as sexually transmitted diseases, right? But STI, STD, you want to know if the person has any of those. Also, if they have any identified sexual dysfunction prior to marriage. It's quite possible, it happens sometimes, but you want to know this. And honestly, if people are honest and upworthy people, they should be willing to go ahead and have a test, a panel done. You can have that done by your primary care physician, just to double check and make sure that nothing, maybe they're not even aware of, is occurring in their bodies before marriage, if possible. If it didn't happen for you before marriage, go ahead and get it now after marriage. Just have a panel done. You want to include in there HIV testing, because it's important that everybody have this done before marriage, and honestly, people should not really have a problem with that. If somebody has a problem with that, they get extremely defensive about that, that's kind of a red flag, and something to really consider, because if a person is honest and honestly saying that they've never done anything, that really should not be a problem. Also, another question you want to ask is, how do you feel when you think about sex? Does it make you nervous? Or does it make you anxious? Are you feeling okay and open-minded about it? Or is there a lot of pressure associated with it? And just being able to talk about that and be honest with your partner can alleviate some of the pressure, because most likely if you're feeling it, they're feeling something too. And it's a way of actually joining together and bonding in a way from the beginning on a conversation that can be sometimes challenging because you've never maybe had it before and you are a little nervous. So just being open and honest about where you're at with that, or maybe you're just not. Maybe you came from a family where these things were openly discussed and you feel comfortable with your body, you feel comfortable with your sexuality, and maybe you're not, but that's a good thing to know as well. So, that's your third question. Fourth question, have you ever used pornography? This is a really important question, especially in 2017, where we have increased usage of pornography. It's not always discussed. It's kind of a taboo topic within our community to talk about, but inshallah, we're going to get better about discussing these ills that enter into our community. And sometimes people engage in these sort of activities thinking that they're trying to protect themselves from something worse. But regardless, whatever it might be, their reasoning for having engaged in such an activity is something you want to know. I'll give you a real life example of where this can go awry. I knew a story of a person who had gotten married, and their spouse, the male, the husband, had used pornography quite frequently before marriage, and the family of the husband was not aware of his activity, and the woman he married was a virgin, and she had obviously never had sex before, but because of his desensitization to sex, having viewed and used this pornography, He made her do things that an inexperienced person would probably not be comfortable doing, and it was harmful to her as well. And so within a very short period of time, the marriage ended because it became sexually unfit. And this is something that could have been avoided early on with a conversation. And it's something that we want to avoid harm to one another. Marriage is something that's sacred. We don't want to ruin it. We're just getting started. So this may be something people are very uncomfortable with acknowledging, or just uncomfortable with because we don't look at pornography as being necessarily a good thing. So, but it's still a necessary conversation to have, because we're in 2017, because this is something that has saturated a bit of society. So it's an important conversation and question to ask. Next, we're going to get into a little bit now. We've covered the basic questions, and we're going to get into some that are a little bit more open. So we're asking, the next question we're going to ask, is there any place on your body that you're uncomfortable being touched? Now, if you've never had sex before, or you've never been touched by a member of the opposite sex, you may not know the answer to this question. That's perfectly fine too. But what you want to know then at that point is, how open am I, or how open is he to being touched? Because some people like being touched and other people don't like being touched. And there's usually a spectrum of people in between. So you want to be very open about that, and kind of take it easy and kind of experiment in a way to figure out what suits you best, right? And just be able to communicate about that clearly. You might want to have words that signify your uncomfortability or your comfortability with each other, like maybe even code words if you prefer that, so that you can not hurt each other's feelings, but say, this feels good or this doesn't feel good, and it's not to you personally, it's just about me. Because the experience itself is about two individuals joining together, and there's two people there, so you need to acknowledge that and be okay with it. So before we get to the next question, I'm going to take a short break for our sponsor, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Muslims and Mental Health. Today we're talking about 10 questions every couple should ask before sex. We're going to continue on now and get back into our questions, starting with, what do you think sex means, and what are your boundaries of the sex forms that you have for yourself? So let's break that down a little bit. When we talk about what does sex mean, we're talking about, how do you define sex? I mean, some people think from that first cursory glance that you're starting the sexual process. Some people mean that it's actually the penetration of, the penis and the vulva into the vagina, right? So it really varies from family to family, and it often goes back to either how your family defined it, or how the access to social convention defined it for you, whether that be through media or school, maybe the mosque, maybe different places where you would have engaged this kind of conversation. So your meaning can derive from a variety of sources, but what's most important is that you and your partner are on the same page about what your meaning around sex is. So you want to first establish that you have the same definition. You don't want to operate blindly and just assume. It's kind of like the milk in the refrigerator. So when you get married, everybody's family has a different place where they put the milk in the refrigerator. But most people assume that the normal way of putting the milk in the refrigerator is the way their family did it. So in the same way, when it comes to definitions of just about anything, but particularly sex, you want to check out, how did your family define this, or how do you understand this as an individual, so that you're on the same page and you can move forward. Secondly, though, within that question is you want to understand what the boundaries are for you. Islamically, we know that there are boundaries in terms of permissibility of types and forms of sex. I'm not going to get into that because I'm not an Islamic scholar, but I am going to say that I know that there is a different viewpoint depending on which madhab you follow or which madhab you choose. So you would want to seek more assistance from somebody who's a learned scholar if you have question about that. But we're just going to talk about some general forms that you might want to ask about, but not getting into the Islamic appropriateness of it, but just acknowledging that these are forms, because there's a chance also you may not know yourself what is Islamically appropriate. And maybe in a future episode we'll have somebody come on who is a scholar to directly address that, but in this particular episode we're not going to address that here. But moving into the more specific forms, the questions you're going to want to ask about, the types and forms you're going to want to ask about are, how do you feel about vaginal sex, right? This is the one that's most commonly known and people are aware of, but for a number of reasons, people may have comfortability or uncomfortability with the topic. So you want to start there. That's probably the easiest one to talk about because everybody has been at some point made aware of that one. Another type is oral sex, right? Do you think that's permissible? Is it okay? Do you want to explore that? Do you want to find out what that's all about? There's a great book that is it has some drawn illustrations, not pictures, but drawn illustrations of sort of techniques and things for people who are not experienced, called The Guide to Sex, right? And that is one that for somebody who has no experience with sex or doesn't understand some of these forms might be useful. It's not particularly promoting one way or the other. It's just sort of anatomical and factual. This is how this works. So for somebody who finds themselves very inexperienced and wants to know the know-how of how to do something, this is a good book for purchase. It's rather extensive, and it's promoting the understanding for people so that they can have a good marital life. So in addition, so we also have anal sex, right? And anal sex is something that I know has, this is where you're getting into shades around permissibility. So it is something that you would want to consult with your imam or your scholar about whether you think it's permissible or not, or where you fall on that. But it is something that people still engage in. So that's another question to ask, like what the person thinks about that, if they are willing or wanting to engage in that. Another type is masturbation. So again, this is in the shades of permissibility. You need to consult on that. But once you're beyond and clear on that point, masturbation can be something that couples engage in. It's something that can be preventive for going outside the marriage. So there are some benefits to understanding what that is about, and also talking with your partner about what they think about that, whether they think that it's okay, first of all, but also if it's something they like to do together with their spouse, or something they'd want to do individually in private. All those kind of questions should be asked so that you have clarity. And then there are still yet other forms of sex. So like there are things called tantric sex. There are sensate focus. And some of these we are going to get into detail in a later show because as we talk about aging and sex, some of these come into play more when people's anatomical abilities start to change. But there are many other forms of sex that we don't normally hear about, but are still relevant in keeping the marriage alive and keeping this aspect, this piece of marriage alive. And again, like I said, we'll have other shows within the series to discuss those in more depth because they deserve a whole show on their own. But for this purpose today, it's just a question you want to ask to put out there, because maybe the person was not even aware that there are other forms. And it could be something you do jointly together to explore as an activity together as a couple. The next question you want to ask is, where would you like to be kissed? This is important information to know. Is it just on the lips? Is it elsewhere on the body? Something you want to explore, don't want to explore, you're not comfortable with? You want to find out where your boundaries are with the use of your lips. Following that, right along those lines, you want to ask the same thing about fingers. Like, how can fingers be used in your relationship, your sexual relationship? Again, there are many uses and many ways of using fingers in the sexual relationship that I would refer you again back to the guide for sex. And maybe this will be touched on in another show at some point, not today. But there are many ways in which people don't normally think about how one would be using their hands or their fingers in a sexual act, but there are many ways in which this can be a part of that process or experience. Then you want to take a moment to really consider processing all these questions and answers, and even the experience once you have it, right? So after you've had an experience or two, you want to, as a couple, to take a moment and evaluate, how are we doing? So that would be your next question. So how would you like to discuss our experiences together? Do we want to do it right after the experience? Do we want to give ourselves some space and then come back, to discuss it? What will make us feel most safe? What will make us feel most honored and respected in our viewpoints and our feelings and our understandings of the experience? And really take the time to be mindful of that discussion. It's not one you want to have haphazardly, because when you get haphazard with this kind of discussion, it can really hurt people's feelings. It can close people off. It can make people feel like shutting down. So you want to honor the fact that this is a very vulnerable place to be when you're having sexual relations, and just honor that vulnerability and be mindful about being particular about when that conversation happens and how it happens. And then lastly, I just want to say those are our 10 questions, but this is just the beginning. So there's so much more to talk about when it comes to sexual relations within marriage and premaritally. And we're going to be doing that throughout this season with different shows talking about different aspects and parts of this part of the marriage. Again, we know that this is one of the top 4 reasons that people's marriages fall apart or that bad things happen within the marriage. So we want to make sure that we're doing our job and our best to be preventive and proactive and try to help our community along so that we can hopefully sustain marriages and stop hearing, well, this person's been married for 20 years. Wow, that's a long time. We don't hear about that anymore. We don't want that to be the case within our community. Our families are the cornerstones, the bricks that build our community. So we want to do what we can to make sure that they stay intact. So I want to thank you for joining us today. Remember, you can always find additional resources on our adjunctive website at www.nefshealertherapy.wordpress.com. You can also contact us with any feedback or comments or concerns that you have at nefshealertherapy@gmail.com. That's nefshealertherapy@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Assalamu alaikum.